Okay, I'm running a few minutes behind, sorry about that. Last week I didn't get this class recorded in the cloud. And it's not like I don't have enough space on the hard drive there, so we lost last week. If you were in class, you got it. If you weren't in class, so that much anyway. I don't even remember what we're talking. But tonight we're going to be talking about intercorporate entities, and one of my favorite spots to invest is the world of corporate spin-offs and split-offs. And I have an article to share with all of you that was in this week's Barron's. So timely, there might be good investment opportunities there for any of you that have some extra capital to put to work. But here we are, it's week 9. The second exam is open. It's an announcement to the class out this afternoon. Opened it this morning. It will be open for 2 weeks, which means November 6th at midnight is your deadline to have that completed and submitted. And remember, I've had this happen more than once. If you're taking the exam on November 6th at midnight, whatever proportion of that exam you have completed will automatically be submitted. So keep that in mind, have it completed by midnight on November 6th, 2 weeks from now. There should be no problem. The second exam is quite a bit harder than the first. Exam 1 was mostly review material. So you should have covered all the basic accounting, corporate strategy, financial statements, the way those are articulated. That should all be pre-written. Modules 4 through 8, which is the second exam, that's harder material. Just be prepared for that. There's sample exams out there on my business course website. If you've done all the homework, kept up with the curriculum, shouldn't be any problem. But when you submit that, just know that the median scores I typically get back on that exam are in the low 80s, which is actually consistent with the median scores for exams university-wide. You should be, at this point in the course, keeping up with your research project. You should have all your material gathered and be on a fairly consistent basis, looking up in your 10K filing any of the tables that we review in class. Tonight we're going to be talking about foreign currency exchange reserves and the translation adjustments that can get fairly sizable for companies like McDonald's or Apple or other multinationals. So sometime this week, looking that up in your filings to create an understanding of whether or not that applies to your research project. The way this class unfolds in practice, however, and the vast majority of you have probably not thought much about this research project. I mean, that's no judgment here. That's the Burn Visionary School of getting through your MBA program. So I just remind myself that in 2 weeks it's going to be creeping up on crunch time, and you all have other clients that you're dealing with and jobs and real world responsibilities. So it's going to feel like a lot, and I'm here to coach you through it. So when you feel like you're about to hit the panic button, just don't. We had the last 3 weeks of class reserved to create that research project, and we can do that again. Tonight is module 9. We're beginning the coursework for the third exam. We'll go 9, 10, 11, 12, then we'll have exam number 3. We don't have a final list. There's 4 more weeks of testable material. And after that, we can shift gears and devote 100% of our time to that research project. And tonight's lecture and next week's lecture is the last of the material that is really technical. Tonight's lecture is a little dry. Next lecture is worse. But after that, the accounting, all the dry accounting, where we're going deep into the weeds and making those adjustments so that we can compare across time periods and across peer groups, that's all done. And we're going to pivot from the accounting side of this class into the finance side of this class. So we take all this accounting data, let's just check the box and call ourselves experts after week 10. We know how to interpret a balance sheet and an income statement, and 90% of this quote unquote material estimates that management management adopted play shenanigans with these financial accounts. We're good on all that. Now we have to take it and distill it down into something usable. And when I say something usable, generally from a finance standpoint, what we want to do is take our informed analysis and forecast it into the future. We're asking ourselves in that basic financial question. That's going to read all the factors. How much money are these companies making next year, year after that? What's the growth rate? What are their margins? If we can answer those questions, then we can throw all this into a discounted cash flow analysis and come up with a value. That pivot happens in week 11, where we'll start talking about forecasting. Before we get there, we're going to talk about intercorporate investments. Before I launch into tonight's lecture, take me the questions. We have a good one over here. Let's review.
When you want us to send you our
So I had offered earlier in the semester, if you gave me enough time, I would give you feedback on your project. But you can't hit me week 15 and say, you know, what do you think of my project? Can I get some feedback? You gotta give me enough time. So if everybody in class took me up on that offer, it'd take me, 30 minutes a piece to do all the feedback. So I would need that research project 3 or 4 weeks in advance. Now, I can count on one hand how many students have ever taken the offer. For all the aforementioned reasons I just went through, because y'all get other stuff. But get it to me 3 or 4 weeks in advance, I'll get your feedback, and at the very minimum, I'll tell you. I can usually tell at that point if you're on track to get it ahead. Right, once I had 2 students take me up on this last semester, and they had just methodically moved through the material week 1, 2, 3, and on. Basically, just said back there and said, here's a couple of things you might think about, but if you're absolutely on track to get an A. Correct. But that's what you want to know. Other questions? Okay, if something comes to you, don't be afraid to interrupt me. Intercorporate investments. It's a fancy way of saying, what do we do when the company that we're working on owns part of another company? And maybe they own 100% of that other company. That's actually the easiest way to do the analysis. That's the easiest way to do the accounting. But seldom does it work out like that. If you're looking at a company like Berkshire Hathaway or another one of these multinationals, they may own hundreds of smaller stakes in other companies around the world. And we have, this won't surprise anybody, various forms of accounting treatment depending upon the criteria that might be met if you own 20s or 30s or 50s or 70% if you don't have control, because there's 2 share classes and it's a family held institution that has ceded control to the legacy class A shares, which happens all the time. So Hershey, anybody ever heard of Hershey candy bar? Well, the company Hershey is actually still controlled by the Hershey family. It's split up into A shares and B shares are what effectively amounts to multiple share classes. And while that family doesn't own 50% of the company, they still control the company. So that terminology control will have a big effect on the accounting treatment that we choose to deploy when we're looking at these intra-corporate investments. So I'm going to walk you through that tonight. And then there's a few odds and ends that our authors smash into this module as well that we'll all hit on at the end of class. There we go. Okay, let's talk about why we would do this. These would actually make some pretty good and hopefully easy test questions and multiple choice format. Companies take smaller investments in other companies all the time for competitive positioning, strategic alliances, maybe you want to penetrate your way into the supply chain a little bit. Been a long day. I was just trying to think of an example of a recent sizable corporate merger to give you some food for thought. I can't even think of one. Somebody throw one out. Anybody think of a merger in the last 6 months, 12 months, 18 months? You're making me feel better. So now I'm not the only one that came out of the weekend a little little bit of a fog. What's that? Just any two companies that have merged. So it's a hospital chain. So that's probably the most common reason that most common underlying reason for any merger and acquisition activity would be seen. Two companies together, sure about all the synergies associated with overlap and sales, marketing, finance, HR, and you get better bargaining power with their supply chain and generally margins, or at least that's the theory. And it's at walls of academia. That's the teachable component of why you would engage in M&A. Looking at careful study of M&A, rarely does it work out that way. Most M&A activity, mergers and acquisitions, value destruction. And a real head scratcher because it kind of flies in the face of what you're expected to get when you buy one of your any theories on why that might be. I don't know this to be the case for sure, but you all know the way I think I'm saying about everything associated with accounting in corporate America. I see it used well, but I see it as. And when you get out there into corporate America and you all find yourselves in the CPO suite, know this, your compensation will be benchmarked to the size of the firm you run. So if for no other reason, it's going to behoove you as the C-suite management team to engage in M&A activity because your firm size, bigger your firm is, if you look at the correlation between firm size and CEO salary is very high. If you plot that on a X and Y axis, you're going to see the bigger the firm gets, the higher the CEO salary. And that's the same thing for the whole system. And I think that produces the value destructive incentive over time to engage in M&A activity for alliance. Academic evidence doesn't identify cause and effect, but it does identify a corollary along those lines. So you might think less about M&A, especially when it's announced by your entity. So now let's put our analysts down, because we all have to make some judgments about the companies that we're working on. If you have noticed a history of M&A by your partner companies, whatever you're working on, we'll go back in time and see if they have any track record of actually creating that. And we're going to look at the accounting. Normally, when you buy another company, you're going to first record it at book value because we can tie that value back to all of the discrete assets on their balance sheet. They have property, plant, equipment, facilities, those are all worth something, and there's a number printed on the balance sheet. What you most often see with M&A, however, is a check or a value associated with that acquisition that's greater than the book value on the balance sheet. So you end up with something more than, and after we attribute that to intangible assets and other goods and services, we'll credit a goodwill line. And if your management teams have been productive, if they've been savvy investors over time, then that goodwill will withstand any tests that we might employ to determine whether or not it's been impaired. So I'm getting way ahead of myself in the lecture, but remind me, I'll circle back around. Okay, here's our three methods of accounting. First, we want to look at the level of control. That's our primary indicator of whether or not we're going to be treating this as a passive investment, meaning we just bought shares in another company, much like we would in our IRA. We don't have any influence over where that company actually operates. That's what we call passive investment. In my world, we differentiate between passive investing as a style and active investing as a style. And that just simply means whether that's the difference between an index. Anybody familiar with like an S&P 500 index? S&P 500 index will go out and buy every company in the S&P 500. You can do that very, very cheaply. There's no thought that goes into it. And that's called passive or index investing. Contrast that to active investing, which is what we're doing in this class, built on the notion that if you're a good analyst, you ought to be able to tell the difference between a good business and a bad business. Go out and build a portfolio of good businesses. That's active investing. So I always have to remind myself that in this context, we're talking about accounting. And the differentiating factor is whether or not we have influence over the management of the company. If we have zero influence whatsoever, we call that passive or no control. So if we have no control, that's going to be bifurcated into little or no influence or significant influence. And then lastly, if we have control, we're going to consolidate that account. And the top line. Let me go to the next slide. Okay, this is a great slide. Star this one. It'll be a good cheat sheet for you when you get to exam time. Top line shows the accounting. So this top line shows the accounting for little or no income. This is the fair value method. And of the three methodologies, I think this one is the most intuitive. We're going to do exactly what you would think we would do if we bought the stock of another company. So the accounting is called the fair value method. From left to right on the top line there, the balance sheet effects. We're just going to record an investment. No differently than if we bought a coffee shop or a car wash or some other type of investment. We're just going to put it on our balance sheet and it's going to be investment in ABC code. The income statement effects. The dividends and capital gains and losses are included in income. So if they pay a dividend, oh, now we're going to put that on our income. That's going to be dividends received. It's going to flow down through net income. If we sell that and report a capital gain or a capital loss, we're going to put the gain or the loss on our income statement. No surprise. And then the cash flow effects are exactly what you would expect. Dividends flow into operating cash, sales and or proceeds from any capital gain or loss will flow through the effect. Okay, now come down to the bottom, all the way to the bottom. The top line was fair value accounting. The bottom line is consolidation. I want to take a look at that one next because it's a little simple. The top line and the bottom line are a little bit more intuitive. The middle line is a hybrid. So let's look at the consolidation. If we have quote unquote control, let's think of a wholly owned subsidiary. If we own 100% of the stock of another company, sure, we have control. Every aspect of that business, we have control over. So we're going to use something called consolidated accounting. Consolidation. That's exactly what it sounds like. We're going to take the balance sheet of the company that we own. So if we're ABC Co and we just bought XYZ Co, we're gonna take both balance sheets, we're gonna add them together. So the asset for one plus the asset for the second one equal the asset for the consolidated. We're gonna do the same thing with liabilities, and we're gonna do the same thing with the income statement. Okay, now go left to right there. So the balance sheets are combined, the income statements are combined, and then say where the cash flows. Okay, middle line, if we are using the equity method, so in this case, we have some influence, but we don't have control. And typically, what you're gonna see is that the level of ownership falls between 1% and 50%. This is where it gets a little bit gray, because like I mentioned with that, the example I used with Hershey, sometimes you have multiple share classes upstanding. Sometimes you have contractual relationships that give companies a lot more control than would otherwise be indicated by the level, by the percentage ownership that they have. And because it's gray, you'll see management teams argue for this type of accounting or that type of accounting, depending on which way they want to push the management. So we'll talk about some of the effects that the various accounting treatments have on things like return on equity. Okay, so equity method. Let's see here. So the balance sheet is gonna look very much like the fair value. The investment account equals the percent owned of the investing company's equities required. Okay, no problem. The income statement. Contrast this to the fair value method where a dividend was paid, we reported that as income. In this case, this is not intuitive at all. When a dividend is paid, we think about that as a decrease in our investment. Very much like we do the accounting for our own internal balance sheet, our own internal income statement. If you own a company, you pay a dividend, well, that's a decrease in cash, your assets. If you own a company and pay a dividend, that's a decrease in equity. Using the equity method, when that subsidiary pays a dividend, we lower the investment in the subsidiary, and we lower the overall equity exposure that we have on our books for that subsidiary. Contrast that to when that company books income. We treat that income as if it were our own. Now we record that income on our percentage share of that income on our income statement. And we use that income to add to the value of that investment on our balance sheet. We're going to look at each of these in a little bit more detail. So that's kind of the high level frame up of each of those. And now let's look at an example.
So my company's Walmart, and others, all has attached to buy pensions. Is there a certain limit of market share of Walmart has to do for the government, like, the government says something, so of course Walmart kind of form it's where there's a certain limit of the market share before the government does something.
No set limit. It depends on the current administration and their view on the regulatory environment. And so the United States looks at merger and acquisition activity, and what they want to see is that it's not going to impose ill effects on predominantly retail consumers. So if Walmart gets too big, they'll have too much power in the industry. And what the SEC wants to see is a competitive retail space. So this Amazon just got accused of this. You know, okay, you're familiar. So Amazon is arguing that they are not a monopoly as it applies to the largest internet retailer or whatever they call themselves. And if you just look at online sales, well, Amazon is the 800-pound gorilla. Nobody compares to Amazon. But Amazon says, whoa, we're not just an online retailer. We're a retailer. You should compare us to retailers. And if you compare Amazon just to retailers in general, well, there's competition everywhere. So depending upon how you wanted to classify it and who the current head of the SEC was. They could come down on either side of that, and then it's probably going to be taken up by a court who's going to interpret that through the lens of other court cases historically and look at the the competitive and monopolistic power of that entity. And the short answer to your question is there's no hard and fast rules. It's going to end up decided by the regulators and the courts. Okay. Passive investments in equity securities. Okay, this is an easy one. I'm going to skip through it fairly quickly here. Our authors are differentiating between marketable securities and non-marketable securities. We're using the fair value method here. So when we have a gain or a loss on a security, we're going to report that as income. What happens if we don't have a quote? If we have a non-controlling interest in some company that we can look up on Yahoo Finance, well, that's pretty easy. We know exactly how much we've made or lost, and we can put that on the income statement. What happens when it's a private business? It's slide number 13. When it's a private business, we're going to have to use something that are called level 3 inputs, which might include market multiples, discounted cash flow approaches, other methodologies that utilize forecasts and other inputs. Basically, when it's a non-liquid security, it's not traded with a price that we can easily reference in the Wall Street Journal or Yahoo Finance. Whoever needs to know what this company is worth is going to have to hire somebody that has been through this class so that they can employ these techniques. These techniques is why this class exists. First, we have to be familiar with the business. We have to know what that business is likely to generate in the future from an earnings standpoint, from cash flows. We have to be familiar with the competitive dynamics that might affect the margins of that business going forward. We have to know what other similar businesses have sold for in the past 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. All of that's going to inform our decision making with regard to what that business is likely worth today. We're going to compare that to how that company has reported it last year, and if there's a material difference, we might have to take a gain. Actually, we might take a loss. We don't ever write the value of a business up. We only write the value of a business down if necessary. Okay, here's an example of the table that you will be able to find in the back of your annual report. So look for this as it pertains to any passive or significant investments that your companies might have, and you'll find more details there. And then word to the wise, it's 2023, so this is less important today than it was when I was teaching this class 5 years ago, but these new rules were put into effect in 2018. So if you're looking at financial statements from 2018 or prior, you may be looking at valuations that have not been adjusted to fair value. Prior to 2018, we had the ability to include those at historical costs without any adjustments to fair value. So you could see some distortions there in the balance sheet, and that used to be a place that you could go to find periodic buys. If you'd stumble onto a company that had a lot of assets on its books that hadn't been marked to market, meaning that they were worth a lot more than the company had reported, you'd see that every once in a while, and that was a buy signal. Okay, let's look at debt. Just like we can hold equities, we have three different categories of debt. So we can hold the debt of another company. So if we go out and we buy the debt of another company, or we buy the bonds of another company, we're going to classify that ownership as held to maturity, available for sale, or trading securities. And depending upon that classification, we're going to use separate accounting treatment for each of those. Held to maturity is just like what it sounds. We buy a bond and we put it in the held to maturity category. We're not going to make any adjustments to the price of that bond. So the 10-year treasury just hit 5% today. That's miles. But interest rates on the 10-year treasury go up, the price of the treasury goes down significantly. We had 34 bank failures earlier this year that those students invested. All of those banks had long-term treasuries on the books. They had big losses because value of the treasury bill declined. Okay. Well, they only had to take losses if they had categorized those securities as trading. If they had categorized those securities as held to maturity, they would not have had to take losses. Why is it? Well, the SEC FASB, they say, yes, the general line of thinking on that is that, especially if you have a U.S. trade, that would be the risk-free rate, because the United States is pretty aggressive. Worst case scenario, they don't default, they just print more money to pay you back. Money might be worth less, but it's the same money you get paid back. You're going to get that $10,000 back. You spent $10,000 on that bond, you're going to get that $10,000. It's risk. So when the value of that bond declines, you're going to hold that to maturity. You don't really need to report that loss because you haven't lost it. Hold it to maturity, you're going to get guaranteed exactly what you thought you were going to get. Okay. That opens a little crack for us as analysts because we're valuing that business today as if, you know, what's the value of that business? What would somebody pay for it today? Well, we would never pay for the treasuries on that company's books. We would never pay full freight for those treasuries because we could walk right over here to the next auction that's held by the Federal Reserve and buy them for cheap. So it's not really true, and that makes it our job as the analyst community to see through that a little bit and adjust the value that we would put on those. Okay, available for sale securities. These are a little bit more liquid. Debt securities that may be sold prior to their scheduled maturities. So because these are in a category that we'll just call maybe we'll sell them, maybe we won't. The SEC says you do have to keep track of the gains and losses, so you don't have to push those gains and losses through your income. So what's happening? Why are we keeping track of the gain or loss if it doesn't go on the income statement? Is it like a shadow gain or loss reported in the back of the 10K filing somewhere? Yes. You can make it as a shadow gain. The official term is that it can be published in something called other accumulated comprehensive income. We've alluded to that once or twice in this course already, but tonight we're going to look at a couple of categories of other comprehensive income. It's not net income, it doesn't go on the income statement, it goes into a category called other comprehensive income. And I think of this as the base, like you get, normally when somebody says the bottom line, well, that's the bottom line, there's nothing underneath the bottom line. Well, there is something underneath the bottom line, it's called other comprehensive income, and we bury that. So it's down in the basement, you gotta know where to go to find it, you gotta know where to go looking for it, you gotta take your flashlight down there and look around a little bit and find out what's in the basement. When we stick these games are locked in the basement. To uncover them, you all as analysts have to go to the 10K filing and look for a schedule called other comprehensive income. And it's gonna show you gains or losses from available for sale securities. As well as other things like gains and losses from foreign currency trade. And cash flow hedges. And accumulated pension obligation gains or losses. Why? Reason why is that these categories can get so big and they're so volatile and they can be so hard to forecast that our accounting board has decided that it would be better to take those off of the income statement for the purposes of functionality, readability, consistency, and include them elsewhere for analysts to make a judgment call about how they will factor it. So take something like this, available for sale securities. Talking about the US Treasury, well, interest rates go up, interest rates go down. Generally speaking, that has nothing to do with the nature of the businesses that we're analyzing. Generally speaking, that is way outside of management's control. So you can think of it, this as the opposite of business from ongoing operations. Earlier in this course, we looked at RONA, return on operating net assets, return on operating profit. Well, that term operating had a lot of significance for us because it connoted the part of the business that was within the say-so of the management. Management team does have control over operations. But we pay a lot of attention to that, and we want that number to be real and meaningful. We want to focus on that, and we want our income statement to be reflective of those decisions, those operations. This is opposite. This is something we have absolutely no control over. It's violently volatile, and on account, we're going to take it and create a complete separate category. Let's look at some examples. Okay, very simple example here for available for sale securities. In this example, last bullet point, assume the fair value of a company's available for sale debt securities increased by $3,000 in the year they were acquired. So here's the transaction that we would look at. We would recognize $3,000 in quote unquote profit by increasing the value of our marketable securities account. And that would also increase our earned capital. So the balance sheet does change. But the $3,000 that would normally flow through the income statement as a gain gets booked to other comprehensive income. Okay. I had touched on the bullet points in those slides already, so I wanted to skip through those and get to this example. We're talking about the equity method of this. So we looked at passive investments, we looked at passive equities, we looked at passive fixed income, the accounting associated with passive fixed income, which can be pushed into other comprehensive income or not. Now we're looking at actually buying a piece of another company. So in this example, Google acquires a 30% interest in Vittel Networks. Vittel, Middle, I don't know, I've never heard of Middle Networks. Anybody else heard of Middle Networks? I don't know. Vittel, okay, what do they do? So, okay. No, it's not me. Okay, thank you. So Mitel Networks for $300. Mitel's balance sheet reports $1,000 worth of stockholders' equity. Mitel reports profits of 100 and pays 20 in cash dividends to its shareholders. Now, in this instance, the 30% interest ought to inform us about the accounting treatment that we're going to apply here. What category was it? It's the name of the slide. This is equity method of accounting. So we're going to start with the purchase investment in Mitel. We're going to credit cash for $300 and debit investment in Mitel. That'll go directly on the balance sheet. Fast forward to the end of the first year, Mitel reports $100 worth of income. Google share is going to be $30 of that because they bought 30% interest. So we're going to debit the investment in Mitel by 30. They just earned 100. Our share is $30. So our investment, as it's reported on our balance sheet, goes up by $30. So now what was a $100 investment in Mitel is now $130 investment. We're going to go ahead and credit retained earnings. And then that's going to flow through on the income statement to equity income. Now, in our third transaction, Mitel pays a $20 cash dividend to Google. Now, this is one that I thought to remind myself to think slowly and deliberately about cash from this year, because when Mitel declares a dividend, they're writing us a check. We're going to go cash that dividend. But our investment in Mitel goes down because they no longer hold that cash on their balance sheet. We're going to walk through and decrease the value of our investment in Mitel by $6. Now we simultaneously have to report the cash because we didn't get a check for $6. That's going to increase the value of our cash. So at the end of the period, we had a $300 investment. We wrote it up by $30, which was our share in their net income. We decreased it by the dividend check we got the mail. And at the end of the period, our value in that investment is $354. Okay, what if Google paid $400 for its 30% stake in Mitel Industries? Well, we know that the balance sheet would only suggest a $300 valuation. If we pay $400, that's going to go into a category called goodwill. Unless we can identify another intangible asset that is yet to be reported on Mitel balance sheet. In this example, we do not. So we're going to have to account for the additional $100 in investment. We're going to look for any intangible. This is kind of the order of operations that we go through when we have excess investment. Excess investment is the wrong terminology, but when we have an investment that's larger than the book value of the target company, we're first going to look to apply that to any unrecognized depreciable assets, any identifiable intangible assets, and then lastly, goodwill. And it's typically going to go into goodwill. And here's an example of that. And this is what I started to allude to at the top of the class. When we pay more for an investment, what we have to be mindful of over time is any impairment to that investment. So here's that example. This is what I want you to look at. But any M&A at all in the last 2 years. You want to look at something like this. So. Altria owns 10.1% the voting interest of AV. This graphic shows Altria and InBev, shows their balance sheets. So we see Altria, they got $1 billion in cash, 36 billion in non-cash. And then they have this investment in AV. And it's recorded at a value of $17.7 billion. Now look at AV InBev's balance sheet, which is a little call out right there to the right. They have for the last 228 billion, liabilities 162, stockholders equity at 65. So right there, stockholders equity, $65 billion. 10%. Okay, so what's 10% of the book value of income? 6.5. What did Altria report that the value of 10% of InBev at? 17. What's the difference between what they have it reported at and what InBev has on their balance sheet? So the difference has to be goodwill or some other identifiable asset. Now, how would we test that for a parent? Is 10% of InBev really worth $17 billion? The balance sheet only says 6%. Yeah, it's publicly traded. But it wasn't. We can just go out and look at the market. And if the market cap of InBev or 10% of that is worth 17, then thumbs up, we don't have to take an impairment. But if it's only worth 6, we have a problem. The folks at Altria made a mistake when they purchased InBev if it's only worth 6 today. Maybe it's worth 20, maybe it's worth 25, maybe it's worth 30. That's the exercise that we have to get through. We have to make some determination about whether or not what they bought is still worth the price they paid for it today. And today might be 4 years later, 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years. Okay. This is a tricky question. It will likely show up on your homework. I can see it showing up on your exam. If it does show up on your exam, it's one of those that's going to take you a little bit of time. Because you really have to think through the implications of both the equity method of accounting does for our ratio analysis. So we did ratio analysis that looked at margins, asset turnover, inventory turnover, cash conversion cycle, so on and so forth. Well, when we use the equity method of accounting, we're consolidating the net income. The net income, our percentage of that net income is coming over and it's going to show up on our income statement. And then we're putting the asset on our balance sheet. Okay. What happens to our return on what happens to our net profit? Right here, bottom of the slide, our net operating profit margin. So if we're looking at our net operating profit margin, you have what's in the numerator? Income. And when we use the equity method of accounting, we're adding more income to that numerator. We're including the model example that we just went through. And how many dollars we get, which are our reported share, we put it on our income statement. Now, when we look at our net operating profit margin, that numerator has been inflated by this equity method of accounting. Okay. What happens to the denominator? What's the denominator of net operating profit. Divided by sales. You can see where I'm going with this. If we use the equity method for accounting, our numerator is affected, our denominator is not. Numerator is bigger, but our denominator is exactly the same. So it's going to appear like we're more profitable than we really are. So that's a heads up play by this room as analysts. You have to understand the accounting well enough to walk through the numerator and denominator as it applies to every ratio that we've looked at in this class and say, well, we used the equity method. It will have an effect on the numerator, or it will have an effect on the denominator, and the outcome is going to result in this ratio being overstated or understated. And you may want to go back and correct it if you so choose, just like we've done with everything else in this class. We make the adjustment where we have. Our office are going to expect you to be savvy enough to make those adjustments. That's one of the conceptual concepts in this class that you set your mind for. So how do you make that adjustment? Well, in the example that we just looked at, if the numerator has been affected by income, but the denominator is not, well, we can just add 6 to the denominator. That's not consistent with the equity method of accounting, but it is consistent with financial analysts who understands what's going on well enough to make an adjustment that would allow them some functionality. So now you compare that number in an apples to apples way against other industry peers to find out which company might be more profitable, which company might be worthy of your investment in the future. Okay, let's look at another one. Net operating asset turnover. So asset turnover is sales divided by assets. So in this instance, sales, that was the denominator of our profit margin that we just looked at. So we know sales is not affected. What about assets? Assets has increased. So the asset turnover well, I was thinking lower, but I'm a little foggy on this too, obviously, because our authors say that the effect is indeterminate. So let me figure out where I'm going wrong here. Net operating asset turnover. So that is sales divided by assets. The investees' sales are excluded from the numerator. Okay, so the numerator is unaffected. Assets in excess of the investment balance are excluded. Okay, so assets in excess of the investment balance are excluded from the denominator. Okay. So if it were as simple as sales are excluded, assets are included, then the denominator would be bigger and you would expect that at the end of the day. Not that simple. Just like the example that we just went through with AB InBev, the assets that are excluded could be very significant if we had appreciation in those assets in the marketplace. We can write those down, but we can never write them up. So we don't know whether or not that asset turnover is really a better indication or a lesser indication of what we might otherwise get if we excluded both sides of the numerator. Financial leverage, liabilities divided by equity. The liabilities are excluded from the numerator. Equity is included in the denominator. So that ratio is going to be understated. Put a little star by those slides, be able to come back to those. I think it'll help you with like a quick reference if it shows up on the homework or exam, and it will. Okay, lastly, let's move into Consolidated accounting. So in this example, we have control or significant influence. We own more than 50% of the voting stock, or we have enough influence to categorize this as something called a variable interest entity. You might see that terminology in some of the companies that you're looking at. Just know that variable interest entities are those we have control over or significant enough influence to lean on consolidated accounting. So bullet points number 1 and number 2, simplify this. 100% of the investee's assets and liabilities are consolidated. 100% sales and expenses are consolidated. And if we have sold anything back and forth, we'll eliminate those in the accounting. Example number 1. Assume Penman Company acquires 100% of the common stock of Nissan. We're going to look at that as separate first. So we're going to look at Penman Company underneath the equity method of accounting. So in column A, we have Penman as a standalone. They've used the equity method of accounting to account for their interest in this. In column B, we have Nissan standalone. In column C, we have the adjustments that we need to make to reverse the equity method of accounting. And then in column D, we have the consolidated financials. So for current assets, easy. $6,000, probably $6 billion worth of assets for Penman, plus 1.4 billion for Nissan equals 7.4 billion for the consolidated entity. No problem. The investment in Nissan. Well, Penman utilized the equity method. So they reported a $3,400 investment in Nissan. Obviously, Nissan didn't report an investment in themselves. We need to make a reconciling entry to get rid of that investment on the consolidated financial statements because it doesn't make any sense. So that becomes a 0 in the consolidated. Then you can see that we add A plus B equals C all the way down with 3 exceptions. So current assets or investment in Nissan goes away. Then you have contributed capital and retained earnings. And I wish the author wouldn't do this, but they make those separate. Conceptually, I think that confuses them. Both of these together are equity. So what Penman has reported in their equity is a 30% interest in Nissan. So we have to do away with both of these equity categories. And now it wasn't a 30%, this is a wholly owned. So Penman has this 1,400 embedded in this number already. Penman has this 2,000 embedded in that number already. Those equity numbers have been inflated. They've been written up using the equity method of accounting to already reflect that 100% interest. So the reconciling entries are made to get rid of those effects. And then lastly, in the income statement, Penman's reported its fair share of Nissan's income. So we can get rid of that equity income from investment. And we have the consolidated statement of cash flows and or balance sheet and income statement. Okay. Well, it's complicated a little bit. What if Penman only owns 80% of the outstanding shares? Now, when Penman utilizes the equity method of accounting, they only have 80% of Nissan's equity, and they only have 80% of Nissan's income recorded on their books. When we consolidate, what happens to the other 20%? You have to make an entry that you probably already seen. You've looked at your income statements, you've looked at your balance sheets, you probably recognize the little line item called minority stakeholders share of income, or minority stakeholders share of income. This is how that gets done. Whenever we have to consolidate financial statements, we have to create a line item for any minority stake that we might not own legal rights to. The same analysis, only in this instance, because we don't own 100%, when we go to consolidate, we have to create these two new highlighted items. Non-controlling interest and net income attributable to non-controlling interest. So the terminology here that our authors are using is non-controlling. I use minority. Those are the same thing. You might see them listed either or. So the accounting is the same. Our investment in NISM over here was 2720. So that number got a little smaller because we only own 80%, but the reconciling entry is identical. Same way for the equity. And then to make everything foot and cross foot, we had to add this 680 non-controlling interest, which is a minority share. Same way down here for equity income from investment. This number is only 320 because we only own an 80% interest. So we're going to make a $320 reconciliation. And then we're going to have to add the $80 of income because this earned 400. We're going to have to add that to this category that we call net income attributable to non-controlling interest. That's how that makes it on the income statement and the balance sheet. When you see that, I suspect it probably shows up for just about every company that you're looking at here. Okay. I wanted to point this slide out. Our authors do give us a pretty good example of goodwill impairment. If you do stumble across one of those situations where you had some consolidating M&A activity, you may get a disclosure like this if your company has never had to take the goodwill impairment. And this is just a oops, we messed up. Think about it as an oops, we messed up. Because in this instance, Kraft, I think it's Kraft bought Heinz, and they took a goodwill impairment of $15 billion. And you can interpret that as, oops, we messed up, which means we overpaid by $15 billion. We lost $15 billion worth of your money if you're an investor in this company. Okay, that's pretty big. That's right. How would you announce that as well? You'd hide it as long as you could, and then you blame it on the guy that came before you, or the gal that came before you, or you first try to take a new job, and so this is a great trick. When you all are, I've seen this used several times. When you all are first promoted to your CEO. What you want to do is look as hard as you can for goodwill impairment. You want to take all the losses you can possibly take and make your income statement look absolutely horrible. Clean up all the dead wood out of the business that you just took over. What you're going to do is you're going to absolutely tank the share price. And you're going to blame it all on your president. Now, if you're smart, you've negotiated an employment agreement along with your C-suite gig. That's typical. And that employment agreement is going to have some of these options that we've been looking at all semester long. And how do your companies get paid? Well, they get paid with some incentive comp. And that incentive comp is negotiated. Not common at all. So if it's negotiated, one very common technique is, well, I want some stock options associated with my time in the business. So when everything takes off, I get credit. I'm waiting to the upside of all the other shareholders. And I want you to award me those stock options during my first 90 days. And we'll just kind of average in and we often raise it. Really? If you can get that in writing, then it becomes a game theory. And it's most advantageous to you if you can drive that stock price into the ground during the first 90 days because your options are going to price. And then when the stock price turns around, which Now, if you're limited to a low price and cost. So you can find goodwill impairment during your first 90 days, report that. Got earnings and stock price down. That's only gonna benefit you as the manager, and I've seen that done and done well.
This is also mentioned at the very end of the annual report,
At the very end of what?
the annual report. Or is this within the budget?
Sometimes, you will see it referenced in the annual control act. But where you can get better information oftentimes is in the current calendar. The companies will have to file something called an 8K, and that's just SEC terminology for your precedent. But say it was a natural design. You owned a manufacturing facility in second, and there's a natural disaster that earthquake or something that thing falling over. Well, that would require an immediate precedent. And you would get all the details of that about evaluation of total losses in something called a deal. Okay. Well, we're about out of time, but I wanted to touch on a couple of other concepts. I mentioned that our authors throw some odds and ends into module 9 here. One of those odds and ends is accounting for derivatives. Derivatives are much like equity investments if they're considered to be a proper hedge. If your derivatives are to hedge your fuel prices or your other commodities prices, then any changes in the value of those derivatives are going to flow through the balance sheet and income statement, but they're going to be almost perfectly offset by the value of the inventory that you're trying to hedge against. Nothing particularly complicated about that. There's another classification of derivative called cash flow hedge, which is not directly tied to anything that's currently owned on your balance sheet, but it's tied to future cash flows that you anticipate unfolding. That's too much uncertainty for the accounting world. And because of that, we put those in a separate category of other comprehensive income. So be mindful of that. And then our authors lastly talk about something called equity carve-outs, which is the sale of companies that we own. And I'll have to go into Barron's and print off a copy of this article, but they're talking about this was just this week's. They're talking about spin-offs. And a spin-off is the example that they give here is Johnson & Johnson just spun off another company called Kenvue. So the ticker is KVU, and Kenvue is their consumer health business. I don't know, consumer, that makes me think of Band-Aid, over the counter type medication. So if that's true, you got a very old line, probably boring company that has very stable cash flows, much like what we looked at when we chose our dividend aristocrats for this. So what's going to happen in spinoff is Johnson & Johnson, their management team gets together and they say, Kenvue or this little consumer medical unit, that's not consistent with the way we see our organization anymore. If we could get rid of that, we could communicate to Wall Street and our other investors that we're redeploying capital into our high growth one. So J&J's in pharmaceutical, orthopedics, and all type of medical devices that are very, very high margin. And that's the glamorous part of their business. Band-Aids is okay, but it's Band-Aids, right? So if you spin off Band-Aids, well, you don't have that associated time. And the financial transaction that unfolds is if you hold J&J Go to Fidelity or Schwab or wherever you keep your money. You log in one day, you see J&J. Log in the next day, now you see J&J, and right underneath it, you see another company that you've never heard of before, called Kennedy. And you're thinking to yourself, what the heck is Kennedy? If you're not paying attention, just own something else, Kennedy. Well, in the world of mutual fund, typical happens is, if you're a large cap value, I mean, you work for American Century, you're Capital Group, or Buffalo Fund, and you're a large cap value. And you hold Johnson & Johnson for all the reasons that you want to hold Johnson & Johnson. Well, the next day you get Kenvue. What do you say to yourself? You say to yourself, not only is that inconsistent with what I want to hold in my portfolio, it also violates my chart, because Kenvue is not a large cap value. Kenvue is a small cap. What do you do then? You just get rid of it. Okay, that dynamic causes uneconomic and forced selling. So what you typically see with a spin-off is that the price action will deteriorate for a period of 60 to 90 days while these market forces wash themselves out. And if you look at spin-offs as a distinct group back through time, and you invest in every spin-off 60 to 90 days after it hits the market, you've beaten the S&P 500 by 10% annually each and every year. That's pretty crazy. That's pretty crazy. It's an uneconomic and forced selling. And that's exactly where Kennedy's at. Kennedy's down 25% today from when J&J spun around. So if you want to invest in Band-Aids, now's the time. KBUE, check it out. All right, we're at time. Thank you. There's a little bit more left to module 9 that I didn't make it through tonight, so check that out, and I'll see you in a couple weeks. Hey. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Tell me how to say your name. Vasudeva?
Yeah.
Vasudeva.
Yeah.
This is it. Okay, one more time. Vasudeva. Va. Deva. Nice to meet you. Yeah, thank you for this. I got you.
Yeah, thank you.